So, Maria, welcome.
Thank you.
So, can you tell me how you came to be an artist? Can you give us a summary of your background and career to date?
Okay, I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and my parents were both architects. And we always made clay figures and painted, and we had also a lot of walks in the bush. And my father was very keen on nature, and we'll go around. He would tell me the names of plants. We'll go with a magnifier, and we were looking at fungi. We'll collect little seedlings and bring them home, and created a little rainforest in our garden. So there were books. My father bought a book on the expedition that drew the botanical flora in the 18th century of Jose Celestino Mutis, and that was books this big. So we had access to a lot of culture. We also
But not Google.
no, we had books, and we had the real world.
Yeah, of
And,
course. Much better.
Yeah, so I think it was very nourishing environment, and they never questioned my decision of studying art. They never asked me how I would make a living. They never.
Silly parents.
No. I'm really grateful because I would have doubted myself, but I didn't. So I just went and.
So you went to, did you go to university to study?
I went to the Universidad de los Andes and I studied fine arts, and then I went to do a master's in New York at Pratt Institute,
Yeah.
which I hated.
Right.
So I left and I applied to Yale University, and they accepted me in the sculpture program. So I went there and I started again. I did a master's for 2 years. I had a government scholarship, and I worked, and I was able to finish that.
Okay. And what media were you working in then? What did you see as an artist? Did you see yourself as a sculptor? Did you
Sculpture.
A sculptor.
And material research.
Okay.
So I discovered myself as an artist seriously in 1985 when I started to research water as a material for my thesis. So I investigated everything about water, the philosophy, the chemistry, the behavior. I experimented, and I ended up making sculptures out of water.
All right.
And when I went to do my master's, I knew I wanted to study materials. And that was kind of new at that time. Colombia was a country of painters, and what I was doing was self-taught in a way. And so I knew really early what I wanted.
Can I ask, when did you have your first show?
1987
1987.
in Colombia, 2 years after undergraduate, finishing my undergraduate.
Right. And tell us some of the other places where you've had shows, just around the world.
Okay, Paris,
Yeah?
to perform at the Pompidou
Yeah?
with my Flea Circus, the Cardoso Flea Circus. New York MoMA, they commissioned a wall installation for the Millennium Show, so that was 99, 2000. New Museum in New York with the Flea Circus. Everywhere in Latin America, Bogota, and a lot of shows. So you get to show around. I lived in Los Angeles and in San Francisco as well, so I had shows there.
Right. So now this is how you can understand why we're excited to have Maria Fernanda showing in our exhibition here. Can I ask you, your practice is there's a rich and dynamic use of many different types of materials and techniques. Can you talk a bit about how you approach materials for a project?
For many, many years, what I did was I would just get the material, a material that was not an art material. It could be.
So not an art material. You were deliberately looking outside of the.
Basically, I knew that I didn't want to follow tradition.
Yeah.
I had an academic training in music. I went to a conservatory since I was 7 until I was 18. And I felt really restrained by that kind of training. And when I discovered art, and I discovered the avant-garde of the 20th century, in which you break with tradition, I just tried to break with tradition, and I also apply that to every project. So I try to break what I did before. So I explore one material, get as much as I can. I smell it, I taste it, I touch it, I pile it, I manipulate it, I read about it, I obsess about it, and play with it. Observation is key, but my hands and my brain are connected. Hands, eyes, brain. So it's that feedback that I use to ask the material what it wants to be and what it wants to say.
There's almost an element of, there's a scientific and experimental approach then in before you even decided what you want to do.
Well, it was hands-on.
Yeah.
Now we're in
Well,
the
you
hands
observe,
of
you
exhibition.
observe, you experiment,
Yeah, but very experimental, and I was very attracted to science since very little, very young. But I never had access to quality science education. My school wasn't, we didn't even have a lab or anything.
Yeah.
So I just, followed my curiosity.
Right. So that sort of fascination that you have with science, with the natural world, and in particular with animals, how have they come to inspire your practice? You mentioned, of course, that you were inspired by what your father showed you, and you've learnt some along the way. You've learnt more about science along the way, and in particular, you seem to love animals. Can you tell us more about?
I did focus on animals for decades, although I'm having a horticultural time right now.
Yeah.
And the past few years I had been, not by choice, but by passion. I'm working with pollen and planting trees and planting bottle trees. But the animals, when I was I don't know, I was working with plants first, and I was growing corn, and I was growing grass, and I was using dirt, and I was being nostalgic of the landscape in Bogota because I was overseas, and I think I was homesick. So after that, all of these plants died, and these artworks that were living artworks died and perished, and they were dead. Simultaneously, it reminded me of the experience of going to the Museum of Natural History as a kid. And I remember these pin insects, and I remember enjoying the beauty of it, but also disturbed by the fact that I'm enjoying death. And I wanted to explore the element of death in life. And I did a little bit with the plants, but they don't preserve well shape or the look or anything. So I explored death through animals. And the reason I was interested in death was also because in the 80s in Colombia we had a lot of violence, and we were confronted by terrorism and political violence and assassinations and bombs, and so it was really in your face, and it was my way of dealing with it.
Okay.
So, but the animals I chose to work with were animals from my childhood.
Right. Yeah.
So I chose flies. They
Yes.
were flies.
And you collected all
Lizards.
those flies? I was just
I
wondering.
bred them.
You bred them. That's really interesting. And the lizard and
The
the
lizards?
frogs and the snakes?
Yeah, frogs and snakes. They were all the animals that, as a kid, they were in the bush,
Right.
and we used to go and collect, kind of play with them and collect them, and and put them
Right.
back. But in the States, I discovered that you could mail order, which was a revolutionary thing. Now you just click buy online, but it was a revolution to think that you could commodify nature, and that you could buy even a fly or a fly pupae. So I bought about 15 fly pupae from a scientific catalog, and I got instructions from a friend who was working at Yale in the entomology department, and she gave me a manual on how to breed my own flies. And I made the little cases and I bred them, and then when they died, I glued them to balls, and I made this circular object full of
Yeah, we had a
flies.
slide just a little while ago of the.
Can I ask, did the flies die of old age?
Yes, they
Oh,
did.
they did, okay.
So
They
no
did.
insects
No,
were harmed
no,
in this.
no insecticide, except that the process was really stinky. It smelled so bad
Yeah.
because you have to give them powder milk with water and a little bit of liver for the females to lay, and that milk was rotting
Right.
and changing the smell. And my classmates that had studios nearby said no more. So I don't remember how the project ended. I hope I released them.
Yeah. Good. Can I ask you, your flea circus? Tell us a bit more about the Cardoso Flea Circus, which is possibly your most famous and well-received work. Do you think?
It's infamous.
Infamous.
It's a legend.
Yeah.
Because in every culture,
Mm.
you have that curiosity.
Yeah.
You mention the word flea circus, and everybody's curious.
Yeah.
And that was where it started. My cats had fleas.
Yeah.
We didn't have any good pet insecticides at that time, so all my cats had fleas. So that was in my list of ticking animals from my childhood.
Yeah.
So I had a relationship with fleas as a kid. And I remember an uncle mentioning having heard a flea circus in New York, and I visualized it in my mind. I was probably about 7, and I saw it. I saw it with the swings and the trapeze, and it was so white, and I had that picture, and I just wanted to do it, and
Right.
it took me years,
Yeah.
but I achieved it.
There's
Real
different
fleas.
manifestations of it too. On the slides, there are a few different manifestations of the.
I
flea
did work on it for about 6 years.
Mm.
I did 2 years of research. At that time, it was hard to do research because you have to go to a library and request, and they will request a photocopy, and the photocopy will come back. So 2 years research, and then maybe 2 years development. That was for my first show at the Exploratorium in San Francisco,
Mm.
which was an art and science
Yes.
institution. And then every year I want to do it better because it was quite primitive, but and so I wanted to keep developing it and also developing the technology to show it. So that was in the turning point between having a TV monitor with a video that we filmed, and we had first a handheld camera just trying to follow the action. So we developed the screen to present it. That was new.
Yeah.
They were basically nobody had projectors. So in those years it was that transition. So I developed that, and my husband, who is also a video artist, he started to do the handheld camera work. So we end up with a show choreographed for the camera and for a 300 people audience.
Right.
So I started with 22 people in the audience, just around. And then we had a show, we had music composed, we had little lighting with miniature lighting designed, and it became a real spectacle.
Sensation.
Yeah.
And was that your first foray into performance?
Yes, I'm shy, or I was shy, and it was terrifying.
Yeah.
I would shake so much for my 20-year-old audience. I would shake that I couldn't put the fleece on the trapeze, so I had to get an assistant to help me raise if they fall.
Well, it's
I
a
was-
tradition to have an assistant at a
I was
circus.
not trained
Right.
as a performing artist, and I actually didn't want any training because it was real. So if I was not I don't know. I was a real trainer.
More
Yeah.
authenticity, maybe.
Yeah, and so if I was a real professor of fleas with my flaws, that's who I was. And if they made fleas made mistake, that's what they did. So I never trained.
Very good. Now, can I ask you, do you have any advice for, this is not our last question, but it's one that I'd like to pause at after we've done this and ask some questions. Do you have any advice for aspiring art students who are hoping to establish themselves as artists?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just aspire for excellence. Always. Not, for that show, but not for tomorrow's homework. For everything that you want to do, you aspire, you do your best. So it's just every step you just push yourself to do your
Quality.
best. And that's how you go from the best you can do to the best you can do to the best you can do, and slowly you just build a career.
What about
No.
things like authenticity? Do you think using machines to make art changes the way people understand authenticity in art or creativity
it
in
messes things up, that's for sure.
art?
Because before it was the artist's hand,
Yeah.
and that's your signature, and now your hand is not there. And I think for the audience that's probably complicated. And the way I solved it was I will handwrite to have my hand in the work.
Okay,
So
that's
I'll just
why.
explain that in the work that we have works that were produced using 3D printing, but there are these beautiful labels that now I know their origin,
Yeah,
they're
handwritten,
So
so that you feel that your
so
hand
there
is
was
there.
so I was the artist because also the objects were so perfect.
Yeah.
And one thing what I saw modernist art in museums in New York was that they were handmade.
Right.
And for example, I remember a John Arp, and it had, you can see the paint and the strokes and all these early 20th
Yeah.
century works were imperfect. They were handmade. You could see the screws. They were not so beautifully produced like most artists work
Yeah.
nowadays. And I like that. I like working with my hands, so
Yeah.
I chose to not work with my hands for this series, but I still have to
You
get
had to put your
yeah.
hand in.
Yeah.
The exhibition, by the way, is called Out of Hand. So now I know that Maria Fernanda has subverted my whole plan for that exhibition, and she's put her hands in there, even though that wasn't what the exhibition was about. But I like that as well. So we have some examples of your work. We have, and the work are examples from a piece called the Museum of Copulatory Organs, that are they're 3D printed. These are actually sex organs that Maria has had printed. You're an early adopter of 3D printing in your artwork. Can you sort of tell us what the Museum of Copulatory Organs is, and then tell us about your decision to use 3D printing to produce it?
Okay. When I was doing the Flea Circus and I was doing my research, I found a quote that described the mating of the fleas and described the penis of the flea, as the male flea, as one of the wonders of the insect world.
Right.
And it was two coiled together, and they say it was so complex that copulation took 8 hours, and it was
That's a
quite
long
a
time.
feat. And it was always in the back of my mind, is it really, true, or
Yeah.
maybe there is more out there? And about 15 years ago, I went to the Natural Museum here to the Australian Museum, and I spent a summer going through every book looking for genitalia
Right.
in the animal world. And what I found just opened my eyes like that, and I
Yeah.
said, this deserves a museum, because we don't know.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of diversity, and there is a lot of complexity. And I tried to get grants to do this project for many, many years. I got knocked back a lot of times. Finally, I managed to enroll into a PhD program at the University of Sydney, at the Sydney College for the Arts, and I finally got a grant, and I spent 3.5 years researching and making the museum that I dreamt